from the Raben Group on federal policy in a time of COVID-19, helping Cleveland and major markets navigate the new normal. I'm Jeremy Paris. I head up the Raben Group's office right here in Cleveland, Ohio. I think I know most, if not all of you, from past roles in town, and it's a blessing during this disorienting and challenging time to bring my colleagues together with so many friends, partners, and leaders in our community to help unpack how we can tap into federal relief and have an impact right here. The Raben Group is a national public affairs and strategic communications firm dedicated to making connections, solving complex problems, and inspiring change across the corporate, nonprofit, foundation, and government sectors. Joining me today are three colleagues, and they'll get a chance to talk to you in just a few minutes. Michael Torra is here. He's a managing principal of the Raben Group. He's led our California team since 2015, and his experience helping run our practice with national foundations, nonprofit organizations informed by years of experience in the political and policy-making process, including as the chief of staff for Congresswoman Linda Sanchez. He's going to help us unpack federal policy, including from the recently passed $2 trillion CARES Act, and where the process goes from here. Also joining us are Jessica McCall, principal of the Raben Group from Detroit, Michigan, our neighbor just to the west. She's a mission-driven strategist who has worked in the White House and in state and local government in Michigan, in leadership roles in nonprofits in Detroit. She can give us insight about, among other things, managing change, staying on mission at a time of challenge to maximize local impact and improve the quality of life for everybody in the community. And last but not least, and then I'll explain what we're going to do very quickly, Robert Raben is with us, my boss, the founder and president of the Raben Group. He created a unique kind of mission-driven public policy firm in 2002, working in an aggressively bipartisan way to drive public policy in a more humane and sensible direction, trying to bring equity to boardrooms and think tanks, corporations, and nonprofits across America. He brings to the table significant experience in law, politics, policy, as an attorney, a senior Capitol Hill staffer, an assistant attorney general who serves on numerous national boards. And he's also a serial entrepreneur in the NGO space. When he sees a problem, he tries to figure out a way to take it on. I suspect when we get to you, Robert, you'll talk to us about the big picture of how policy is formed and what we can do to shape it. A couple just opening thoughts from me, and then I'll leave it to the experts. Like it or not, we are all managing enormous change right now at a pace that would have seemed unfathomable weeks and months ago, both in terms of facts on the ground and the policy response to them. How do we manage it all? How can we understand the resources that are now available to us through the CARES Act and others? How we can identify gaps and shape the relief and resources we'll need in the months ahead? And what will the new normal look like from a policy perspective, and how will that impact you and your work in the community? We'll get into all that today. I do want to note, I think my parents are watching this live stream, so if I seem nervous, that's probably why. Mom and Dad, I miss you, and thank you for staying physically distant. Your grandkids are doing great. We'll set aside, last note, about half the time today for questions from you. If you look to the right of your screen, there's a chat box. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, you can do it there. Our colleague Charlie will then help funnel it to us, and we can open up for Q&A. You can always reach me anytime after this, jparis@rabengroup.com, with follow-up questions or thoughts. All right, so let's get started with Michael. Michael Torra, joining us from California. Can you kick us off with an overview of the legislation to date? What should we be thinking about?
Yeah, sure. So first, just in terms of the legislation, I know a lot of information is already out there, so I don't want to belabor it. But just to recap on the big ticket items, right? The 6 main buckets. We've got about $500 billion for loans to support large businesses. The loans are also applicable to large nonprofits, states and localities, but really the focus is on the business. We've got a pot of $377 billion for small businesses and nonprofits. Most of that money is this forgivable loan program called the Paycheck Protection Program. And then there's some other loans and grant programs as well. There are, number 3, the direct payments, also known as the recovery rebates or the economic impact payments. These are the direct checks that are going to go out to individuals. Then there's the unemployment insurance enhancements, and the bill includes actually a lot of very welcome enhancements to states' unemployment insurance benefits systems. Then, of course, the funding for our healthcare infrastructure, hospitals, community clinics, for equipment, facilities, personal protective gear, et cetera. And then the last kind of big bucket is the coronavirus relief fund for states and localities, right? So basically grants that are going out to the states, proportional to state population, that are just going to help them address various costs relating to responding to the coronavirus. And there's also some important policy provisions, right, that aren't tied to federal spending. So, for example, enhancements to charitable deductions, the suspension of student loan payments, forbearance for homeowners and owners of certain rental properties, moratorium on evictions, all very important policy provisions that are included in this latest legislative package. So in terms of what comes next, and I think that's what we want to talk about a lot today, it's important to keep in mind that just because Congress has passed the bill doesn't mean that all the money is going to get to where it needs to go, or that these policies are going to be implemented as efficiently and as inclusively as I think we would all like them to see be done in order to impact the greatest number of people in a positive way. So, different agencies are going to are responsible for different buckets of money and implementing different policies. They're going to be moving at different speeds. Some of them have deadlines that were written in the legislation that they have to meet. Some of them weren't. So it's going to take a lot of advocacy to try to push agencies to move perhaps more quickly than they otherwise would, and to ensure that they're issuing out guidance in a way that's more inclusive. And we can get into some examples where we've already seen that play out just in the past few days. And then, and so I think, those are the main things that we'll be seeing in the coming days. Oh, and then of course, what was left out, right? And what's going to be part of a follow-on legislation. And I know we'll be talking more about that. But conversations have already started, not bipartisan formal negotiations, but more conversations among policymakers with their constituents, with interest groups, with their state leaders around what, and health professionals around what else is going to be needed next. And so a lot of brainstorming is already happening for that. And you're going to see a lot of work around what will be probably a much heavier lift to get a fourth bill done. So I'll pause there and turn it back to you, Jeremy, so we can hear from our other colleagues.
Thank you, Michael. And we'll put a pin on what comes next. We want to get into that as well as the local scene. I also want to point out that Michael Torra is also an artist, and the work behind him is his own. So we bring a lot of gifts at the Raben Group, and Michael among them. So thank you, Michael. Let's turn now to Jessica McCall, joining us from Detroit. Can you give us your perspective, Jessica, on where we are, what you're thinking about in terms of organizations, how to help people strategize, and sort of any big picture thoughts you have?
Sure. Thank you, Jeremy. The biggest takeaway that I want people to have is to remember to adjust, don't abandon. Everyone, all of your organizations, you all came into this work, and your organizations exist for a reason. And now is not the time to abandon your mission and your vision and panic and just to respond to the crisis that we're all in. You want to make sure that your populations and your constituencies are being served and are receiving the resources and support that they need. But remember why you were motivated to do this work and what brought you here. I think about, and I'm not going into sports, but I'll make some comparisons to Detroit and Cleveland. But, there are people here who want to do great work and do big things. And now is the time to be on the front end of that, as opposed to when I think locally and at the state level, you're going to hear a lot about the federal piece of it today. But when thinking at the state and local level, people are really going to be looking to you and your organizations because you are on the front lines and because you have the relationships with the populations that are being served. People are really going to be looking to you to figure out what direction to go. So, those programs and those big ideas that you had, now's not the time to walk away from them. Now's the time to figure out how can they work within your population, consider the resources that you have, and be realistic and honest with yourself about those resources, and figure out how you can implement the work that you were already doing. But you'll start to see what is needed from your constituencies as this continues to evolve. And you'll be in a position to respond to all of that. But what I don't want people to do is to think that they need to abandon their vision and their mission because they're so focused on responding to the crisis. I'm going to be brief because I know we have a lot of other things that we want to touch on, but that for me is the most critical thing, to adjust, not to abandon your vision and your mission.
Thank you for that, Jessica. And we're going to get back into that, especially as we look forward to what comes next and how do we fill in some gaps and think about how to advocate for that. I do want to point out for the sports fans in Cleveland, the ESPN aired Game 5 and 7 of the 2016 NBA Finals last night. Many of us watched again, and I got to be honest, I still wasn't sure we'd win, and yet we won again. So, there we go. And I know you're a basketball fan too from our.
Yes, I'm not sure how, people can watch reruns of games, but so many people are doing that.
There's not a lot of other sports on TV.
No, so, there's not.
Robert, Raben, Jessica, we'll come back to you. Robert, let's turn to you. Coming from the home office in DC, and what can you give us a sense of the big picture, where you are and what you're thinking about as we look ahead?
Well, the big picture is Tiger Team. You got to be watching that. Forget about sports. Thank you very much, and thank you, Jeremy, for the work that you're doing in Cleveland, really helping people, organizations, governments figure out all kinds of public policy solutions. We appreciate you. The biggest way for me is in an era in which partisanship is everything, and we can't decide about what to call a paperclip without it being partisan. The third stimulus package passed the Senate 96-0. And the only reason why I think it wasn't 100-0 is some of the senators were out because they're ill. So we are still capable, and I think it's terrific news for the nation, of coming together for bipartisan policy solutions. Of course, it's easier to spend money than it is to cut money, but it's still quite significant that people were able to come together, and that's elected officials, that's staff, that's organizations, it's obviously the current Trump administration. The important piece going forward is a reminder, anybody over the age of 30 who's sort of been through other crises like 9/11 and the Dodd-Frank and the 2007 recession know that when the ground shifts, anything is possible. And that's true in public life, it's true in private life. When the fundamentals of what you thought was sound in the morning become unsound in the evening, there's the appropriate shock and concern and desperate look for leadership. But what separates the girls from the women is the knowledge that anything is possible. And that's true for bad things. We ought to be concerned about privacy issues and security and the frailties of particular leaders that we have, and them bringing their insecurities and issues into public policy. But it's also great stuff. And great stuff only happens when there's a vision and there's people in there like you fighting for change. So in this last stimulus package that we saw, still not a week old, we have for the first time at the federal level paid leave, something that people have been working on for 27 years. And many said was just not going to be doable with conservative and corporate objection. But now we have it. Unclear whether it will be permanent, but we have a toehold at the federal level on paid leave. You also saw that gig workers and some independent contractors were included as workers for some of the unemployment compensation assistance and the direct payments. And that's quite significant too. There were major public policy battles about what to do and how to accommodate the benefits of gig workers. An eviction moratorium at the federal level, something that's completely a state function. So I won't go on and on. There's stuff that from our perspective is terrible. The Department of Labor decided that it would suspend all affirmative action requirements in contracting for at least 3 months. It's unnecessary, it's gratuitous, but it's the option for people to work out their policy issues in a fast-moving conversation. But the most important takeaway is we are now in a period of concern and insecurity where public policy is going to be made very quickly. And it's crucial that people be working with their elected officials, state officials, federal officials, your terrific Senator Sherrod Brown, to make sure your policy concerns are well known and advocated for and fought for. Now is the time.
Thank you, Robert. So just keeping on you for a moment. We want to focus on what has already passed, but you sort of teed up what is still to come. On an earlier call, you talked about this, the biggest redistribution of resources possibly since the Civil War. Massive policies being made now. Is it enough?
No.
Is it enough?
No.
Yeah.
Not enough. But that's a binary question, yes or no. Is it enough? No. We are not going to be able, for example, why is the distribution to adults $1,200 as opposed to $12,000? How do you come up with $500 billion for paycheck protection for small businesses, all of which is terrific, and $1,200 for a person? These reflect fights about power. Who has the power? Whose priorities prevail? So there's no question in my mind for the deeply, deeply beleaguered single mom who works at Popeyes, who's got 3 kids, who's trying to distance learn with no computer. We're nowhere near enough in terms of supporting that family unit. But people are going to fight for more. We're going to do the best we can. And people need to stay focused, as I said, on fighting for your priorities.
Jessica McCall, can you sort of picking up on that theme, and everybody should feel free to jump in on this. What do you think are some of the biggest focuses to be in the next round of legislation? So what are some of the gaps you're seeing in the community that you're thinking about in terms of articulating, figuring out advocacy and what we need to do going forward?
Well, more than the legislation, here in Detroit, we're already seeing some, to be quite candid, fraud. The greatest thing that the organizations who have joined us today have our trust. And what you all can do is to help the populations that you serve navigate this huge piece of legislation. We're seeing a lot of things. We're all on a lot of email chains. We're seeing the legislation packaged up and branded in different ways and being sent around. And that's confusing for people who are not experts at analyzing legislation and parsing through to see what is relevant to them, and it's intimidating. So for the organizations, whether you are working specifically with small businesses, you really have to be candid and honest with them and help them manage and look through this information so that they can pull out what is most relevant for them. Here in Detroit, we're seeing in the financial and banking space, they're really putting lipstick on a pig. Not every zero interest or deferred payment is good for every small business when you start to look at the fine print. So for those organizations, nonprofits that work with small businesses, or for the nonprofits that work with individuals, the best thing that you can do right now as experts like McCall and Jeremy and Robert, analyze the legislation, you can then take that information and put it in a way that people can really understand, so that they know how to get the resources that they need. Because that's going to be one of the biggest challenges, is trying to determine what is potentially fraudulent and not going to be able to help people, and what's real. And people need help with that.
Yeah, we have I think it's true in Detroit too, but we have a very mature ecosystem of sort of civic organizations that help marshal resources, and the Cleveland Foundation, Gun Foundation, Jewish Federation, United Way of Greater Cleveland, and many others. Mount Sinai Healthcare Foundation are doing a great job of. We've created a reserve, a rapid response fund, and others to try to marshal a community response. And this is one more for you, Jessica. How important is it for organizations to sort of advocate, to not just take in the sort of wave of information you're getting now, but find ways to advocate and say, these needs are needs we're seeing on the ground. I wouldn't assume that everybody knows everything. Is that right?
That's true. And, your legislators, your congressional members at all levels, local, state, and congressional and the federal level, they need to hear from you. You are on the front lines. You know what your constituency needs. So, and listen, it's a two-way street, because your greatest resource is your people. Then you have the ability to develop a relationship with your legislators and the people who can advocate on your behalf by presenting opportunities, especially right now, for them to connect with your constituencies and to be able to as an elected official, have the opportunity to share information with them. So if you are capable of putting together a Tully Town Hall or conversations like this, it's a great idea to invite members to those conversations, because it gives them an opportunity to share information, as well as hear directly from the people that they serve on what they need.
So that's such great advice, Jessica. Thank you. And Michael, what we're talking about is, situating ourselves in a continuum of, we've had 3 pieces of federal legislation now. The big one was, of course, the CARES Act, which just passed, the $2 trillion CARES Act. What's happening right now? Can you talk to us a little bit about what's happening at agencies, what's happening in the regulatory process, what's happening in Congress to move us forward into identifying gaps and taking care of the next needs?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of what's happening at the agencies, they're, as I had alluded to earlier, they're drawing up their guidelines for how to disperse funds, the application forms, whether it's for states or localities or other entities, for individuals, right? And so that's happening. And we're really seeing that it's extremely important to keep an eye on that. So for example, I'll use the one example. The IRS put out guidance on Monday about how the direct payments, the recovery rebates, are going to work. They basically said, if you've already filed taxes for 2018 or 2019, you don't have to do anything. The refund will be sent to you. If you didn't, then you're going to have to fill out this form. Well, for a lot of lower income people, for retired folks who are just receiving Social Security benefits who don't file taxes, how are they, number one, going to know about filling out this form? How are they going to fill it out if they don't have a computer at home, if they're on the wrong side of the digital divide, they don't have broadband access, et cetera, et cetera? Again, any kind of additional paperwork requirement, imposing that is just another hurdle to try to keep people away from receiving a benefit. It was completely unnecessary. The previous 2 times where there have been direct payments back in the 2000s, this was just done automatically. The legislation actually provided for that, spelled it out. So this was a relatively easy lift. Like, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House immediately jumped in, reached out to Secretary Mnuchin to say that this needed to be rectified. So there's been a partial rectification just for those who receive Social Security benefits. They're going to be getting their payments as the legislation had spelled out. There's still some questions about other lower income groups. So additional advocacy is going to be needed, whether it's advocacy directed particularly at the agencies that are carrying out these policies, or to congressional allies who can then weigh in with those agencies, as the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee did. So that's one example of what's happening right now. And folks have got to move fast, right, to do this and to weigh in. We already see like the loan program for small businesses and nonprofits is going live tomorrow. For gig economy workers and independent contractors, it'll be next week. But that stuff is moving fast. And so folks need to organize and advocate and make their voices heard very quickly.
Yeah, and just for everybody's knowledge, I think people probably know this on this call, but the window opens tomorrow, Friday, April 3rd, for small businesses and nonprofits. The rules are roughly the same for small businesses and nonprofits, under 500 people to apply for the Payment Protection Program loans, which are forgivable loans. If certain things like keeping payroll are met, independent contractors next week. We can get into specifics about that. There's lots of good guidance there. Michael? Yep.
And let me just make a point. Also, my advice to folks is move fast, okay? There's $350 billion in the fund for nonprofits and small businesses to be able to avail themselves of what's called the Paycheck Protection Act, basically a forgivable loan that provides kind of a bridge for 8 weeks to help you cover payroll and rent and certain other expenses. There are 30 million registered small businesses in the United States of America, okay? And so that $350 billion, if everyone got the maximum allowable loan, which is $10 million, that's 35,000 businesses. So you do the math. There's not going to be enough for everybody. So I would just urge small businesses and nonprofits in Cleveland to move quickly and jump on it tomorrow. Get that application and get moving. You just go to the SBA approved bank. It's probably the bank you're already working with. Just go to them and get it moving.
Yeah, and there's good advice on SBA.gov. Actually, they have a very clear explainer. Independent sector, Jewish Federations of North America, and others have great walkthrough advice. So there's a lot out there. We'd be happy to point you to some. It's supposed to be a very simplified form and different thing, but yeah, move fast, get to the head of the line. Robert, I wanted to pivot to you for a moment. One of the questions that I received from a community leader and ahead of this is, they run a big institution and they love what's here. They're applying for loan. It's 2 months, right? And unemployment insurance is what, 4 months. How do we prepare for the long term in terms of what that means with policy? How do you do it institutionally? What advice do you have?
Brain that what the entire nation is going through, obviously it's hotter and different than others, is a forced re-questioning of all of our assumptions. What is the relationship between work and physicality? If people are, those who can in the white collar professions, working from home, what does that mean? What does it mean to interact and have intimacy if you can't have physicality? And that's true both on the job and with your families. How do we I won't go through every aspect of life, but every aspect of life is being re-questioned with our basic assumptions. For the strong, that's an opportunity. Be creative. How can I save money going forward if in fact the presumptions on which I relied were not entirely true? A macro thing that we're going to see, and the right and left talk about this for different motivations, so many of the benefits in this nation are tied to employment, is the right way to go. Healthcare, leave, et cetera, is all tied to the job, your pension. I think we're going to see a massive hurtling forward of alternative methods for creating the social benefits that we want. You're going to see a fantastic appreciation for frontline healthcare workers, particularly nurses, in a way that you haven't seen in many, many years. And I say this, Riley, I have kids, you're going to see a brand new appreciation for the role of the teacher. People are forced to homeschool and fuss with technology and content, particularly if you have multiple children at once while they're working. So, I think there's enormous opportunity here for business leaders, institutional leaders to rethink the role of physical space, the role of gatherings, the relationship between infrastructure and fundraising, and what is the employer's role in benefits.
That is some great advice, and I will say that as somebody with young kids at home, the idea of a baby boom coming out of this is only for the people that don't already have kids. I think for everybody else, it's a reminder of how important teachers are. Before we turn to questions from the audience, Michael, I wanted to pivot back to you for one question. You've been running numbers. How much do you know about how much Ohio specifically will be getting from the CARES Act, the $2 trillion bill that has lots of buckets? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of different funding streams, right? And some of them are calculated by formula, existing formula, the formula spelled out in law. Others, it's up to the agency to decide. So it's not like I can give you like one ballpark, number right now, but for certain categories, certainly, and it's significant, right? The coronavirus relief fund for states and localities, Ohio's share is going to be around $4.6 billion. So that'll go to the state. Large metropolitan areas can also apply, but it's taken from the state share, so the total will be the same for the state. You're going to have about $489 million coming to local education agencies through the state. There's going to be another $100 million going into what's being called the governor's emergency education relief fund. So that's $100 million just that Ohio is getting out of the national fund. You've got $474 million going to public transit agencies in the state of Ohio. You've got $116 million going to childcare centers, so to keep them afloat during this time, but also in particular to be able to provide services for healthcare workers, first responders, so that they have someone to take care of their kids while they're doing the critically important work that they need to be doing right now. And then for Cleveland and other cities in the county of Cuyahoga and Cuyahoga County itself, we're probably looking at about $19 million in community development block grant funding. Mayors and civic leaders love these funds because they're very flexible in terms of how they can be used, whether it's for homeless services, anti-poverty measures, public health needs, et cetera, et cetera. So critically important funds in a time like these when local budgets are being stretched thin.
So I think you know this because you visited Cleveland recently. Jessica and Robert have also both been to Cleveland relatively recently. Cleveland's a community that prides itself on its cultural sector and the arts. And at a time when we have so many critical needs for relief and obviously at the front lines of the health crisis and then the emanating economic crisis around it, are there things in here for the arts and what can we focus on there? And by the way, the arts and other cultural institutions.
Yeah, sure. And well, as you already alluded to, Jeremy, being an artist, myself, I'm pointing like the wrong way as I'm looking at camera. I'm really thankful that there are provisions in this bill. I mean, obviously, not only do the arts play an important role in just enhancing our own lives and how we experience life and enriching our soul, but they're important to many people's livelihoods, right? I mean, for a lot of people, this is their job. And as a sector, right, the arts and humanities generate billions of dollars for the American economy. So it's quite right that there is funding to support that sector in the CARES Act that was just passed. A certain chunk of the money for the National Endowment for the Humanities and National Endowment for the Arts is allocated by formula. So we already know that Ohio is going to be getting about $1.2 million of that to support that really critical sector. And then also nationally, the Institute for Museum and Library Services is going to have about $50 million to be able to distribute as grants directly to museums and libraries throughout the country. So I really hope that Cleveland's very rich community of museums and libraries take advantage of that. Those funds are going to be able to help support their efforts to expand kind of digital network access and have more internet accessibility, et cetera, which is obviously so important during these times.
I did check in when we were talking last night, McCall. I checked in with Felton Thomas, who runs the Cleveland Public Library, and he was well aware
Good.
that pool of money. And I think just a reminder to folks to follow and track the various buckets of money and really be on top of it. Raben Group will be hosting a webinar, by the way, I'm sure you know this, next Tuesday at 1:30 about what this means for artists. So anybody who's interested, we'll send around a link. My sister-in-law, Jackie Hobing's piece is behind me, and my brother, Norm Paris, is also an artist. So let's take care of artists in this as well. They enrich our lives. I think, one last question, Michael. You sort of had this breakdown. Are you willing to share the Ohio breakdown with the group today? Could we send that around?
Absolutely. Yeah, let's send that around as a follow-up to this.
Okay, I think everybody would get a lot out of it. I know it was eye-opening to me, so thank you.
Yeah. And again, those are, and it'll be in the document, those are estimates, because obviously the agencies have to give the final number, but those are estimates either from congressional committees or the Congressional Research Service. So feel pretty confident in those numbers.
Yeah. So Charlie, who's operating this off camera, as it were, can you feel free to let's start teasing up some questions from the group, and everybody should feel free to jump in here to whatever strikes their fancy. So I'll read it aloud from our friend Joe Zimmerman, who runs Global Cleveland. Longtime listener, first-time caller. Thank you for this info. Can you share how this policy impacts the English as a learning language community, immigrants, refugees, DACA sisters and brothers? Joe's one of our frontline leaders in the community. Start with you, Michael, and then.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question, Joe. So for immigrants and refugees, and some of the, obviously, everyone's being impacted by the economic downturn that the coronavirus crisis has caused. And of course, immigrants are highly overrepresented in a lot of the industries that are being most heavily hit by the crisis. They're facing layoffs. When it comes to the unemployment insurance benefits, as well as the direct payments that are going to be going out, any immigrant with work authorization who has a Social Security number will qualify for those. So that also does include immigrant youth, sometimes called Dreamers, those who are enrolled in the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, those with temporary protected status. Most folks in those categories will have Social Security numbers, so they'll be able to access these. Undocumented immigrants, unfortunately, will not have a way to access that. In the education space, there weren't specific carve-outs in the legislation as it related to English language learners. The funding that is going out to states, that number that I had quoted, that's over $400 million for elementary and secondary education in Ohio, is based on Title I funds, and it can be used for a broad array of purposes in order to kind of help keep some continuity of education in these difficult times. It doesn't specify anything about English language learners. So again, that's where implementation is going to be so important, right? Working with state agencies, with local educational authorities to make sure that as they begin to spend these dollars, that they're going to do so in a way that's fully inclusive and mindful of everybody who needs to be touched by them.
Robert, Raben, do you have thoughts about this and sort of the context of this question as we look ahead?
Yeah. Well, no. Yeah, I have thoughts. It's just so emotional and tough. The larger issue about people's willingness, some people's willingness to divide us, and sort of we're all in this together. People of every status are working as frontline workers in our fields to make sure that we have food security, and it's painful to see some still willing to divide safety and health and welfare by origin and how we identify.
Jessica, I know so much of your work is focused on making sure that underrepresented communities have a seat at the table. Can you talk a little bit about how you react to this and what we need to think about from a policy making and sort of organizational management perspective?
Sure. When we think about and talk about the least of these, there's still a segment of that population that's not being considered. And that's what frightens me most. When we're talking about people who are either formerly or currently incarcerated, people like undocumented immigrants and others who rely on all of the people who are joining us today in order to maintain a degree of quality of life. So, when I'm talking with organizations who focus on that work, you really have to be honest with yourselves right now. Everyone has to kind of take a step back once you get a handle on the systems and logistics and the operationally of managing the day-to-day. Now's a good time to take a step back and what did this crisis reveal for you and your organization? Again, it's not about abandoning anything, but it's taking a moment to look and see where your gaps are. And especially in the social services space, as we move into more of a holistic direction, how can you collaborate and create more partnerships? If you're great in the workforce development space, how can you partner with other organizations that focus on other areas so that we're not just trying to, there's a tendency to, when you're working in a social services space, to think that you're the ones that should create that next program. And that's not always necessary. There could be an organization down the street from you or in another part of town who is doing the work that could complement yours. And this is a really good time to look around and think about how you can be more collaborative within your communities in order to support, especially those who are not always considered when we're creating legislation and other ways to support the American public.
That is a great and powerful answer. Next question comes from Kirsten Ellenbogen, who runs the Great Lakes Science Center, wonderful museum and center of learning in our city. Thank you for all this. What are you hearing about upcoming legislation? What is next for nonprofits and small businesses after the PPP loan funds available are depleted? Robert, why don't I start with you this time, and a little bit of what are you hearing about the next rounds and the appetite for this from congressional leaders that you're in touch with?
Notwithstanding my starting comments about bipartisanship, we are starting to skirmish again. Senator McConnell and Majority Leader McCarthy have already expressed a disinterest in a fourth stimulus package anytime soon. Leader Pelosi and Minority Leader Schumer have already laid down a marker for what they want to see. They may end up working directly with President Trump on what's broadly referred to as an infrastructure package that will, as of now, be the organizing theme. It's a bit of an inside joke in Washington because Trump has been talking about an infrastructure package since his campaign, but has never put one forward. The Democrats have, since probably 1932, been extremely interested in significant federal funding on roads and bridges and other construction. So there's likely to be two things. Significant proposals for massive federal spending to bolster the state coffers. Many states have balanced budget amendments, and they're going to see a huge uptick in costs, healthcare costs and unemployment insurance and other costs, and a crash in sales tax revenue and maybe property tax revenue that other people can't pay. So the feds are likely to step in to subsidize some of the holes, the state budgets. Second, direct spending, unclear whether it will be through block grants to the states or direct projects through financing, through the Transportation Department, Commerce Department, et cetera, for massive infrastructure projects. And that would be anything from the Port Authority revamp in New York to fill in the blank. throughout the country, and that'll be a scrum for projects. We will have skirmishes about labor provisions and whether or not union wages should prevail. Then you're going to see massive pleas from educational systems for support, more support for hospitals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The cancellation of Puerto Rican debt. So it will be a grab bag of spending that has been in the pipeline and wishes for important constituencies for a long time. Unclear what the final packages will be. The second, as I said, I'll say it quickly, is there'll be tons of technical corrections. The first three bills were done extremely quickly. And there are going to be literally thousands of questions about eligibility requirements for all kinds of federal assistance. And so you'll have to see some fixes to that which has already passed.
Dr. Amy Acton, who's become a bit of a folkier here, the Ohio Department of Health Director, is starting to prepare us for a longer time of crisis, a longer stay-at-home time. And Michael, I'll pitch this to you. With that, with this sort of growing awareness that this is not something that happens for 2 months and goes away, that organizations can be thinking of the long haul. How does that play into policymakers' minds? Thinking about, is there another, Robert was alluding to, is there another 2-month tranche of loan forgiveness? Is there of loans and loan forgiveness, the extension of unemployment insurance? And I'll ask the second part of that question right now. What ways are there to influence that outcome? We are not helpless bystanders here. How do we make sure that these needs are heard and answered beyond the sort of partisan wrangling that Robert alluded to?
Yeah, sure. Really good question. Look, and I think Robert raised this earlier in this webinar, that when there's a mass sort of public pressure and when there's a crisis, that policymakers will move and enact things that under normal circumstances they say can't be done, right? So like the paid leave, now enhancements to unemployment benefits for gig workers, et cetera, small business loans for the self-employed. The ability to be able to pass another package that includes a lot of the things that Robert was just talking about is going to depend on the sense of urgency and crisis that policymakers are feeling. So the less that they feel pressured and the less that they feel that there is pain and hurt going on in America, the more likely they are to say, as Mitch McConnell has in recent days, let's just focus on implementing the CARES Act. There's a lot of good stuff in there, and we'll leave everything else to later. Well, these small business bridge loans, they only last for 8 weeks. Everyone's going to have spent their stimulus check by, the end of May, early June at the latest, depending on when you get your check. So there is going to be need. And so the ability to add more than just maybe a little bit of infrastructure construction is really going to depend on the sense of urgency and crisis that policymakers are feeling. So it's really important that we're telling policymakers the stories about what's going on in communities, right? Provide the anecdotes, the data, et cetera, so that they understand that there is a lot of pain and hurt that still needs to be addressed, so that they continue to act boldly.
Yeah, and we really need to think about forms of advocacy that we don't lay aside just because we're in this time of physical distancing. Narrative and storytelling is something we work with at the Raben Group as a powerful form of advocacy, and I think that has to continue. The next question is from Philip Roland Seymour, who works on equity, diversity, and inclusion at university hospitals. Are there safeguards in place built into the federal legislation or at the state, county, or city level to ensure the equitable distribution of CARES Act relief? Jessica, I don't know if you've looked at the bill for those things, or if we should start with. I know this is a focus of your work, and then we go to Michael for some specific.
Yes,
provisions.
Actually, let's start with Michael. He is the expert in this, and I'm comfortable with that.
Well, as far as
stories for us. Yeah.
As far as the legislation is concerned, unfortunately, there aren't. I mean, and certainly don't have a lot of faith in the implementing agencies. Robert already provided the example of what Department of Labor did in terms of suspending affirmative action requirements for federal contractors. There's not a lot of foresight in this legislation about how to ensure that these funds are distributed equitably. And that's why it's so important to just follow the money in terms of where it's going and to advocate vis-a-vis those who control the distribution, for those who receive it, every step of the way to, raise the need for equitable distribution of those funds. Because, if this is done wrong, what we're going to see is even greater disparities across this country in terms of how different communities are faring. We've got a massive amount of resources that are now flowing, and it's critically important that we not be asleep at the switch at this point. Implementation is actually going to take a lot more work than it took to actually pass the bill.
And
Jessica, you want to react? Yeah.
The only thing that I would add is, this is squeaky wheel time, and coalitions really do matter and they make a difference. Again, partner. You don't have to go at this alone. You don't have to go at this as your one organization. Bring in other whether it's like-minded organizations, or if you're doing this as a region, work together. This is the time to really be inclusive in how you approach your advocacy.
That's great advice. I think we're going to go to one last question here, and then we'll get some last thoughts. From Jim Ratner, who is my uncle. I'll just full disclosure, it's a family matter here in Cleveland. The biggest piece of this bill is $400 billion, and more than that, for big business controlled entirely by Mnuchin, who's the Treasury Secretary. What qualifies companies for inclusion in this, and what oversight do you expect? Robert, I know you have a career involved with oversight. You have to talk about that.
Massive oversight. People are singed by the TARP experience, and get ahead of that. Ms. Pelosi has already constituted a sui generis, sort of an ad hoc oversight committee that Jim Clyburn will chair. It's going to be bipartisan. So that will be the beginning of the oversight. The complicating factor is the Trump administration has an exceptionally narrow view of what they think Congress has standing to ask about. They don't send up witnesses. They don't do testimony. So we're going to have a real fight for those people who are concerned about the equitable distribution of resources, anti-corruption, anti-fraud. We're going to have a real battle on our hands, which will be unpleasant because we're going to want folks to be focused on relief, not fighting.
So, Senator Brown has been very focused on the oversight provisions. It was a key negotiating piece between the first version of the CARES Act, and what ultimately passed was Democrats fighting for quite a bit of check and balances and an inspector general, a congressional panel. My understanding of this, and I did oversight when I worked in the Senate, is that those things are still being stood up and being fought about between the Senate and the Democrats, and between the administration, and the spend is going to trail the actual spending out the door. The provisions are meant to provide real-time reporting, real-time information. I think with the new programs that are formed, old programs that have formulas, the new programs that don't have formulas built in, there's going to be spending we're going to learn about later. So I think we have to keep focus on the need for oversight and pushing our leaders to stand up the things that were built into this legislation that were keys to its passage. We are close to our hour, and I wanted to give everybody time for sort of a last thought. Jessica, why don't we start with you, then Michael, then Robert, and get some last thoughts as we conclude, and then I'll have one final note, and look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak with the people of Cleveland and Ohio. I would just go back to what I started with. This is simply a time for adjusting and making sure that the people that you serve are a part of the conversation and get the resources and support that they need. Don't rely on your legislators and your elected officials to have the answers. You all are going to have great answers, and you're going to have great thoughts and ideas on how to move us out of this crisis and what we can do to address the problems that many of you already knew were there and that many of you were already working on. So don't wait for them to come to you with solutions. You have solutions. You have ways of meeting the needs that existed well before the COVID-19. So, when the time comes, and it will be here soon, take some time to put some energy into those ideas and plans that maybe you were sitting on because other things were distracting you from them, and present them to your legislators and present them to congressional members, because they need guidance and information from the ground on how to move forward and how to be better prepared in the future. So thank you for what you're doing and what you will continue to do. And we are really all in this together.
Well, thank you for your insight and expertise, and we'll continue to be in touch as we move forward with this. Michael, Torra, any final thoughts?
Yeah, to echo everything Jessica just said, she made very, very good points. So I sign on to all of that, and just thank you to the people of Cleveland. I look forward to getting back to Cleveland. I was hoping to be there this spring, but obviously that's probably delayed now because of everything going on. But looking forward to getting back there soon. Again, just stay engaged. Remember, you need to be engaged at every level of implementation, and also fighting for what's coming next and making your voices heard.
All right, thank you for your insight on the bill. Thank you also for preparing the document we'll share after that breaks down the funding that's already in the CARES Act for Ohio, and for helping advise us on what are the steps that come next. I know at the firm we are relying on your summary, so thank you for that too. Robert, any big picture thoughts as we conclude this talk and look forward to the future?
Yes, thank you, Jeremy, so much for putting this together. It's really, really valuable. A time of massive dislocation and uncertainty is also a time for opportunity. And if you're not in there fighting for the constituencies and the people you care about, someone else is fighting. And your folks are going to get the short end of the stick. We are at your service at Raben to help guide you, staff you, fight for you, fight with you on your priorities. And I'm just so appreciative that so many are coming together on the progressive values that we care about.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thanks for doing so much for you about it. You said it, I think, earlier here and before, is that these policy debates are a function of power as well as values, and we have to bring our voices to the table to shape the future. We are not helpless with this. It can feel helpless at times. And I know that I feel good being in the trenches with all of you and being part of this community here. So a couple of just final notes. I want to, first of all, thanks Charlie Crocker, our colleague. We're road testing this new platform. We certainly would appreciate all of your feedback on the experience of it as we look for new ways to communicate in this environment and to stay in touch with each other. I also wanted to volunteer to be in touch with all of you. I'm going to risk giving my email out over the broadband here, but jparis@rabengroup.com, RAB as in boy, ENGROUP.com. And please follow up with me. I know I see questions from the Michael Hauser we didn't get to about how can we advocate for more K-12 funding. There's so many others there as we look forward. How can we help you? This is a fast-moving, dynamic situation. Just sort of taking it in and digesting and knowing where you are. One last note, please, as Michael Torra said, get in line for the small business loans. I know you're all working to keep people employed and keep doing your missions. If you are a nonprofit or a small business, the window is open tomorrow. There's guidance online. We can help point you to other guidance. and we're all in this together. This is a time for, it seems very difficult, but we're all in it together, from DC, from California, from Detroit, and here from Cleveland. So we're going to sign off, and we look forward to being in touch with all of you soon. And everybody be well and take care of yourselves.
Bye.